minutes, and then we can break for discussion, and then more talk and more discussion. I'm going to use the term occupied territories to refer to the occupied West Bank and Gaza. While East Jerusalem was and is also occupied, it has been annexed by Israel, and so the Palestinians who live there experience different conditions. So just a quick review here. This map shows the areas that Israel conquered in the 1967 war. You have the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. The outcome of the 1967 war was disastrous for the Palestinians and Arab states, and it soon became known as Naksa, or the setback. Nevertheless, in the next decade, the Palestinian resistance and national movement grew and gained widespread recognition on the world stage. During and after the war, the Israelis focused on expelling Palestinians from conquered territories. Due to international scrutiny, Israeli soldiers resorted more to psychological warfare than outright expulsion. Trucks with loudspeakers patrolled the streets, urging Palestinians to flee. You have 2 hours to leave your homes and flee to Jericho and Amman. If you don't, your houses will be shelled. In Qalqilia, after 12,000 residents fled, soldiers destroyed 900 homes. The population of the Jordan Valley dropped by 88%. However, the Israelis did not entirely forsake violence. Planes bombed 3 refugee camps near Jericho, emptying them. Several West Bank villages were also demolished, including Imwas, Yalu, and Bet Nuba. The villagers' crimes? They had fought the Zionists in 1948 and successfully resisted their dispossession. Israeli General Yitzhak Rabin expelled the 8,000 villagers, forcing them to walk 32 kilometers to Ramallah. Soldiers were then ordered to demolish the, quote, nest of murderers. One soldier recalled, quote, the fields were turned to desolation before our eyes, and the children who dragged themselves along the road that day, weeping bitterly, will be the Fedayeen of 19 years hence. This is how, that day, we lost the victory. This ethnic cleansing has a Canadian connection. After the expulsion, the Israelis planted trees and turned the area into a park that was financed by Canadian Zionists. Today, there is little evidence of the villages in Canada Park. This is the village of Imwas, and it has a biblical connection. It is the old village of Emmaus in the Bible, where Jesus traveled, and I believe he took a meal there after his resurrection. And so that's what it looked like before it was destroyed. And some of the people being expelled. So that's what it looked like after it had been leveled and all the people expelled. And they planted lots of trees, a lot of pine trees. It's one of their favorites, and that's what it looked like after it had been reforested. So in 2022, I was able to visit there on one of my trips, and so I visited the park. So these are some of the images. And you can see that it is, all of this is being organized by the Jewish National Fund, which actually in Canada recently lost its charitable status, which was a great victory for justice. And throughout the park, you see these different kinds of monuments or whatever with the names of the Canadian Zionists who donated to the park. One of the picnic areas. So there's several walls like this, outdoor walls with lists of the people the donors. And it was interesting walking along, looking at them and seeing whose name were familiar. And among them were the Bronfman family of Montreal and Heather Reisman, the owner of Chapters Bookstore, Indigo Books. There was a few others, but these are all the donors, or some of the donors, that made the park possible. The war and ethnic cleansing created a flood of refugees, 10,000 to Egypt and over 200,000 from Gaza in the West Bank to Jordan. Half were refugees from the 1948 Nakba. At one point, 5,000 refugees were crossing the bombed-out Allenby Bridge to Jordan each day. For the Israelis, the Six-Day War heralded a rebirth of Zionism, similar to the Balfour Declaration in 1948. It was also a military success and a public relations triumph. Israel again successfully portrayed itself as the Israeli David prevailing against the savage Arab Goliath. Grotesquely, a country founded on ethnic cleansing was winning praise for a war described as, quote, the triumph of the civilized. But it worked, and Western media portrayed the Arabs as dark, devious cowards, and any journalists who presented the Arab view were accused of anti-Semitism. The biggest benefit of the war for Israel, however, was increased American support. It was a turning point in American-Israeli relations. Years earlier, in 1951, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz had observed, quote, the West is none too happy about its relations with the Arab states in the Middle East. The feudal regimes have become more reluctant to supply Britain and the United States with their natural resources and military bases. Therefore, strengthening Israel helps the Western powers to maintain stability. Israel is to become the watchdog. If for any reason the Western powers should sometimes wish to close their eyes, Israel could be relied upon to punish one of its neighboring states whose discourtesy toward the West went beyond the bounds of the permissible. In 1967, Israel demonstrated that it was a capable watchdog. A U.S. State Department memo explained, quote, Israel has probably done more for the U.S. in the Middle East in relation to the money and effort invested than any of our so-called allies and friends. The Israelis won the war single-handedly, have taken us off the hook, and have served our interests as well as theirs. Israel embraced its watchdog role, and the U.S. rewarded it with $1.5 billion of weapons. Soon it was receiving 10% of American aid. Following the war, Israel's priorities were to secure and develop its conquests, the land it had, quote, liberated, and to expel or subdue any Palestinians who resisted. The immediate focus was newly conquered East Jerusalem, home to the Western Wall, the holiest site of the Jewish faith. Israel wanted a united Jerusalem, and so it annexed East Jerusalem and it vastly expanded the city limits to incorporate Arab lands and villages. This was illegal under international law. So this is a map of Jerusalem, and It's a little confusing because the blue line that goes through it is actually the green line, which is the internationally accepted boundary between the West Bank and the state of Israel. So you can see West Jerusalem, and then on the right of the blue line there is East Jerusalem in turquoise and green. And then the rest encircled by the red on the east side of the blue line is the land that Israel annexed. It unilaterally expanded and took in a whole lot of villages in that area in Arab land and said this is now part of the city of Jerusalem, and therefore it's been annexed and it's part of the state of Israel. So that was arbitrary, and the Palestinians who lived there had nothing to say about that. They had no say in it. And so here we're looking east. You can see in the middle of the picture the Western Wall, which is the holiest place of worship for observant Jewish people. And just in front of that are a lot of several homes, and that was known as the Moroccan Quarter. Beyond it, you can see the Dome of the Rock and then the Mount of Olives in the distance. And so as soon as the Israelis conquered the old city of Jerusalem in 1967, one of the first things they did was to flatten, destroy all those houses in the Moroccan Quarter. And so here you can see them cleaning it up. They gave the people who lived there about 2 hours to move out, and then they bulldozed it. And if you go there today, it's a gigantic open-air plaza that accommodates people who are coming to pray at the wall or tourists, sightseers. But it used to be a whole neighborhood. Israel also wanted Jerusalem to be overwhelmingly Jewish, and so it began a campaign of Judaization in East Jerusalem. The Palestinian mayor and administration were ousted, Arab banks were closed, Israeli currency and taxes were introduced, and Arab land was expropriated. Israel did everything it could to legally get the residents of East Jerusalem to leave. Most stayed, and they were deemed to be permanent residents, not citizens, which made them subject to deportation. So these are some Israeli soldiers praying at the Western Wall. The Arab states emerged from the war humiliated, but outwardly defiant. At a meeting in Khartoum, they affirmed the right of the Palestinians to their homeland, pledged to expel the Israelis from the conquered territories, and confirmed the three no's: no recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. However, it was clear to everyone that Israel was now a permanent regional power, and Arab nationalism was a spent force. Talk of liberating Palestine faded as leaders focused on how to regain their lost territories. The Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, was also weak and discredited. During the war, the chairman had publicly vowed to, quote, drive the Jews into the sea. Fatah rejected this overt racism, declaring, quote, Palestinian operations are in no way aimed at the Jewish people, nor do they intend to drive them into the sea. A few months later, Fatah affirmed its vision of a democratic, peaceful state, quote, on which the Palestinian Jews will again live in harmony, side by side with the original owners of the land, Palestinian Arabs. Palestinians were now scattered and more scattered and fragmented than ever. 1/3 were now living under military occupation in the West Bank, in Gaza. Over 50% were outside the borders of historic Palestine, and the remainder were second-class citizens in Israel. For most Palestinian nationalists, the war destroyed any illusions of Arab unity. Arab nations were clearly divided, inept, and incapable of taking on the Zionists. Palestinian-led revolutionary guerrilla warfare was the only way forward. The summer of 1967 saw a curious interchange of peoples. Israelis flooded into the markets of East Jerusalem, Gaza and the West Bank to shop and gawk at the exotic Palestinians. Israel had so effectively isolated the 48 Palestinians that for many Israelis, these were the first Arabs they had ever encountered. Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza also visited Israel, seeking their, quote, lost paradise, as one writer put it. They gaped at the traffic lights, swam in the Mediterranean, visited the homes they had been expelled from in 1948, and reunited with their 48 Palestinian relatives. The reunifications were often awkward and emotion-filled. Palestinian writer Emil Habibi compared the 48 Palestinians to people who had been in prison for 20 years, only to discover that their families had now joined them. Some West Bankers accused the 48 Palestinians of being cowardly in remaining in 1948 and not resisting. This while they enjoyed the material goods that Israel offered. By contrast, the West Bank was backward and underdeveloped. The 48 Palestinians enjoyed the reunions and reconnecting with the Arab world. However, they rejected the wishful thinking of their West Bank cousins, as their experiences had instilled in them a bitter realism. One resident of Nazareth recalled, quote, having lived under Israeli rule for 18 years, we knew there was no magic formula, no throwing of the Jews into the sea or wiping Israel off the map. One 48 Palestinian offered his West Bank relatives some advice. Quote, it will only be a short honeymoon. Afterwards, the hardships will start. First, they will impose heavy taxes. Then land acquisitions will start. And then what is left of the land will be rendered out of reach through land use planning. He was right. Israel followed the model it had developed for the 48 Palestinians and placed the population of the occupied territories under military control. Harsh laws were introduced, and soon permits were needed for daily activities. The Israelis knew how to control people with permits. Under Military Order Number 101, a permit was needed to wave a flag, to print political literature, and to hold a political meeting of more than 10 people. Detention without charges, curfews, and home demolitions became common. Expulsions continued. Order number 125 stated that any East Jerusalem or West Bank resident who was absent from their home on June 7th was considered an absentee, and their property and lands were confiscated by the state. So if on June 6th someone had driven to Amman in Jordan and stayed overnight, they were now a penniless, homeless refugee. Overnight, 5,000 East Jerusalem residents were expelled. The mayor of East Jerusalem and others were also deported for their, quote, non-cooperation. Fatah played no part in the war and emerged ready to carry on the struggle, declaring, quote, we are united in our resolve to free our stolen homeland from the hands of the Zionists. Arafat believed that the West Bank would be an excellent base for Fatah as the residents would back the Fedayeen. In September, he and other leaders secretly entered and began establishing networks. However, by the end of the year, the hope for support had not materialized. West Bank Palestinians were not ready to sacrifice all, as they, unlike the Fedayeen from the refugee camps who had already lost everything, still had lots to lose. They were focused on getting the Israelis to leave the West Bank. So Arafat moved his base to Jordan. By this time, many small resistance groups had sprung up, and some formed the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or the PFLP. Its leader, George Habash, was the young doctor who had been expelled from Ramleh in 1948. The PFLP embraced Marxism-Leninism and linked the liberation of Palestine to an uprising against Western imperialism and the uniting of the Arab world by overthrowing reactionary regimes. It became the second largest resistance group. Some members eventually formed the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So this is one of their posters, and you can see the connection with Vietnam. So at that time, there were a lot of anti-colonial struggles going on, and they all felt very connected. In November 1967, the UN tried to settle the June War with Security Council Resolution 242, which emphasized, quote, the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war and the need to work for a just and lasting peace in which every state in the area can live in security. This required, quote, withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict and termination of all claims of states of belligerency. It also called for the right of every state, quote, to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, and for the, quote, achieving a just settlement of the refugee problem. Resolution 242 was deliberately ambiguous and ignored the Palestinian people, framing them only as a humanitarian and refugee problem. It also implied Arab and Palestinian recognition of Israel. The PLO rejected it, stating that it was, quote, fundamentally and gravely inconsistent with the Arab character of Palestine, the essence of the Palestinian cause, and the right of the Palestinian people to their homeland. It ignores the existence of the Palestinian people and their right of self-determination. Many experts agreed, quote, it dismisses the Palestinians as one might dismiss a non-people, one wrote. Quote, Palestinians do not exist in Resolution 242. In spite of this, Resolution 242 became the general framework for mainstream peace initiatives. On January 1st, 1968, Fatah issued its first English-language press release. The 1,500-word document passionately articulated the Palestinian cause. An excerpt, quote, the Palestine problem is essentially the problem of an entire people, the Arab majority of Palestine, uprooted and expelled from their homeland in order to permit the establishment of Israel. For 2 decades, Israel has denied the Arab refugees continual requests to return to their land. The communique affirmed that, quote, al-Fatah will continue undermining the Israeli Zionist existence until Palestine has been restored to its rightful owners, the Palestine Arabs, who have lived on this land alongside the Jewish minority uninterruptedly for 4,000 years. A few months later, Fatah described its goal as the establishment of a, quote, free, open, non-sectarian, non-racist society in Palestine. Its enemy was not the Jews, but the Zionist movement. The Fedayeen continued attacking Israel, often from the Jordanian town of Karameh on the east side of the Jordan River. As rumors of an Israeli reprisal spread, the population fled. Many expected the outnumbered Fedayeen to do the same, but Fatah decided that its 400 fighters would remain. A communique explained, quote, the Arab nation is watching us. We must shoulder our responsibility like men with dignity. We must plant the notion of steadfastness in this nation. We must shatter the myth of the invincible army. Fatah was determined to, quote, convince the Arab nation that there are among them people who do not retreat and run away. On March 21st, 15,000 Israeli soldiers attacked. During the day-long battle, Jordanian forces and the Fedayeen inflicted heavy losses on the Israelis, who eventually withdrew. The Fedayeen had lost nearly half their forces, but they had bloodied the enemy. The Battle of Karameh was, quote, a resurrection of the Palestinian people and a turning point for the Fedayeen. One said, quote, we stuck it out that day so as to wipe out the memory of June 1967. Arafat stated, quote, what we have done is to make the world realize that the Palestinian is no longer refugee number so-and-so, but the member of a people who hold the reins of their own destiny and are in a position to determine their own future. Fatah members became the heroes of the Arab world. Recruitment soared, and by late March, 20,000 Fedayeen were training in Jordan. Several Arab states offered support. Iraq and Syria set up training programs, and the Gulf states and Lebanon raised funds. Within a year, Fatah had branches in about 80 countries. So it was about that time that Arafat appeared on the cover of Time magazine, which was in those days where a lot of people got their news. During 1968, a schism developed between Fatah and the PFLP and other radical groups. Fatah only attacked military targets in Israel and the occupied territories, while the PFLP and others had begun attacking international civilian targets and hijacking commercial airliners. This polarized Western public opinion, and many began to equate Palestinians with terrorists. So this is one of the better known PFLP fighters. It's Leila Khaled, and she was one of the few women that took part in the high-profile operations, and she helped hijack 2 commercial airliners. I took this picture. This is on the separation wall, the apartheid wall in Bethlehem, and I took this when I first went there in 2012. So she became a bit of an icon. It's amazing that she is still alive today, because a lot of the people who were involved in that kind of those kind of operations didn't survive. But she certainly became an icon among the Palestinians. And here are some of her thoughts. By June 1968, 2,800,000 Jews were ruling 1,500,000 Palestinians. Following the war, Israelis had debated different courses of action. One group wanted to keep the conquered lands, some because of security, claiming that the Jordan River was a defensible border. Others were motivated by ideology or religion. The Jews had a divine or ancestral right to it. A second group favored returning the occupied lands as part of a peace deal. Many of them saw the dangers of occupying a people against their will. One wrote, quote, "Our right to defend ourselves against destruction does not confer on us the right to oppress others. Occupation brings foreign power, which brings resistance, repression, terror, and counter-terror. The victims of terror are usually innocent people. The retention of the occupied territories will turn us into a nation of murderers and murder victims. Let us leave the occupied territories immediately." Israeli intellectual Yeshayahu Leibowitz foresaw an equally hellish future. He said at the time, quote, "A state ruling a hostile population of 1.5 to 2 million foreigners would necessarily become a secret police state, with all that this implies for education, free speech, and democratic institutions. The corruption characteristic of every colonial regime would also prevail in the state of Israel." Israeli leaders ignored these voices of reason and, remaining true to Zionism's settler colonial roots, decided to occupy and colonize the territories. This forced another decision. Should they annex the territories or simply occupy them? Annexation required granting citizenship to the inhabitants and the end of a Jewish majority state. But if Israel denied the inhabitants basic rights, it would be a colonial apartheid power. Mixed into these considerations were Israeli fears of the high Palestinian birth rate. Prime Minister Golda Meir voiced this apprehension when she famously confessed that her sleep was often disturbed by the thought of how many Arab babies had been born during the night. The desire for an ethnically pure Jewish state prevailed, and Israel occupied the land and denied the inhabitants any rights. Since 1967, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza have not experienced one day of freedom, equality, human rights, or national self-determination. Most Israelis easily adapted to their new role as occupiers. Many refused to use the word occupation and referred to the occupied territories as, quote, administered territories or liberated territories. Not much changed except that poorly paid day laborers from the West Bank filled Israeli construction sites and the kitchens of restaurants. There was little personal contact. Palestinian nationalism remained a constant concern, and Israeli leaders worked hard to delegitimize the concept, to suppress the collective identity of the Palestinian people. A classic example was Golda Meir's 1969 declaration that, quote, there was no such thing as a Palestinian people. It's not as if we came and threw them out and took their country from them. They did not exist. Menahem Begin refused to use the word Palestinian. He believed that all historic Palestine belonged to the Jewish people and warned Israelis against even token recognition of Palestinian national rights. He told a group of farmers, quote, when you recognize the concept of Palestine, you demolish your right to live here. If this is Palestine and not the land of Israel, then you're conquerors and not tillers of the land. You're invaders. If this is Palestine, then it belongs to the people who lived here before you came. For West Bank and Gaza Palestinians, the brutality of the occupation was everywhere. One Israeli writer described it as apartheid, Israeli style. Land expropriation had begun, nearly 150,000 hectares on the West Bank and 12,000 hectares in the Gaza Strip. Administrative detention, holding individuals indefinitely without charging them or bringing them to trial, was widespread, and thousands of Palestinians languished in concentration camps in the Negev desert. Frequent Israeli nighttime raids were accompanied by shootings, beatings, torture, and theft. Thousands were arrested on the flimsiest pretext, and deportations were common. Collective punishment included extended community curfews, and home demolitions inevitably punished the innocent. In 2 years, Israel destroyed over 7,000 Palestinian homes. This abuse had not gone unnoticed at the UN, and in December 1968, the General Assembly passed Resolution 2443 that, quote, expresses grave concern at the violation of human rights in Arab territories occupied by Israel. A special UN committee was established to investigate with instructions to report annually. Following the 1967 war, there was much talk of peace agreements. But Israel never seriously considered giving up the West Bank and Gaza. To avoid being forced to do so, it began creating, quote, facts on the ground, establishing Jewish settlements. In this, they were following their time-honored maxim, quote, where the Jews settled, there they would remain. Judaizing East Jerusalem was their priority, and they began building settlements in the eastern suburbs. The idea being to gradually isolate the city from the West Bank. Then came a few in the Golan Heights. The most high-profile settlement was in the Palestinian city of Hebron, a holy city for Jews and Muslims. In March 1968, Israeli religious nationalists visited Hebron and refused to leave. The government finally settled them in an old nearby military base. In early 1969, the resistance groups took control of the PLO and elected Yasser Arafat as its chairman. The transition had begun a year earlier. Increasing popular support for the Fedayeen groups had forced the Arab states to surrender control. So here you can see Arafat and Nasser in the middle. And another image from that era. What exactly was the PLO? One researcher described it as, quote, the general organizational framework within which all Palestinian organizations, commando groups, trade unions, professional associations, as well as prominent national figures, meet to work for the achievement of Palestinian national goals. Almost all the resistance groups were members. The most important PLO institution was the Palestine National Council, or PNC, the supreme authority of the PLO, and the equivalent of a parliament in exile. Its executive committee served as a cabinet and elected the chairman. Elected members represented a cross-section of the Palestinian people. By 1969, one-third of them were from Fatah. Like Fatah, the PNC viewed the Zionist state, not the Jewish people, as the enemy of the Palestinians. In 1971, it affirmed that its goal was a democratic, secular state in historic Palestine that would guarantee the equal rights of all its citizens, quote, regardless of religion or language. Other PLO institutions included the Palestinian National Fund, the Palestine Red Crescent Society, Palestine Research Center, and the Palestine Planning Society. The PLO was a legitimate government in exile and deeply involved in the lives of the Palestinian people, especially in the refugee camps. The PLO continued to expand in Jordan, and by mid-1970, it was becoming a state within a state, increasingly controlling segments of Jordanian society. The 200 raids a month it launched on Israel were drawing harsh retaliation, and King Hussein watched in horror as events spiraled out of control. Not only had he lost the West Bank, but now the future of his kingdom seemed to be in jeopardy. In September, PFLP gunmen hijacked 3 civilian airliners, flew them to Jordan, and blew them up. That was too much. Hussein declared war on the Fedayeen, and in a long, bloody campaign that became known as Black September, he expelled them from Jordan. The king described his decision as a, quote, cancer operation that had to be performed to save Jordan's life. Okay, so should we take a break and see if there's any questions or comments or anything? Well, I'm going to keep going. We'll get that last one later. I'm just going to continue then. The PLO relocated its headquarters to Lebanon. The move was not a complete setback, as the previous year it had struck a deal with the weak Lebanese military. The terms stipulated that the PLO would take direct control of the 15 official refugee camps in Lebanon that were home to 300,000 refugees. Palestinians would have the right to live, work, and move freely throughout the country, and most importantly, to wage armed struggle against Israel from Lebanese soil. The agreement was in many ways a formalization of the existing situation, and the weak Lebanese government was cooperating with the inevitable. Over the next several years, the PLO took control of southern Lebanon, which became known as Fatah land. Fedayeen attacks increased, and the PLO again became a state within a state and involved in Lebanon's internal affairs. In late 1970, the UN General Assembly passed 2 resolutions. The first, number 2649, affirmed the rights of colonized people who are deprived of self-determination to restore it, quote, by any means at their disposal. Resolution 2672 further affirmed that, quote, the people of Palestine are entitled to equal rights and self-determination, and declared, quote, the inalienable rights of the people of Palestine is an indispensable element in the establishment of a just and lasting peace in the Middle East. These resolutions reflected the profound change that had taken place at the UN since 1947. Its size had more than doubled from 56 to 127 states, and many of the new members were former European colonies who had waged their own national struggles for liberation. They, along with the Soviet Union and China, viewed the PLO as a legitimate anti-colonial movement. So just looking at this poster, it's a Fatah poster from that era. The posters that I've used in these presentations, I tried to place them in the general chronological era in which they were published, to give you a little bit of a sense of place. And But you can see on the map there, there's a sort of a map of Palestine. It's got a lot of text. And I've reproduced that text on the left. And it's basically stating publicly the goals of the Fatah fighters. So I'll give you a moment just to read that. Acts of violence continued, culminating with some Fedayeen taking Israeli athletes hostage at the 1972 Munich Olympics. The Fedayeen belonged to Black September, a shadowy resistance group born of frustration, despair, and a belief that only by shocking the world could Palestinians obtain justice. The hostages and most of the Fedayeen were killed in a shootout with police. In their wills, the slain Fedayeen apologized to the Olympic athletes. Quote, but we want them to know of the existence of a people whose country has been occupied for 24 years and their honor trampled underfoot. They appealed to their Palestinian countrymen not to abandon their guns. Quote, our land will be liberated by blood and blood alone. The world only respects the strong. We want Arab youth to know how to die for their people and their country. Israel reacted to the Munich attack by bombing Syria and Lebanon, killing hundreds of Palestinian civilians. The world press debated terrorism. Many condemned it, but some writers argued that, quote, terrorism was the weapon of the weak and the oppressed, of people who had no other means of fighting. They also pointed out that Israel was founded on terrorism. An opinion piece in the Guardian newspaper observed, quote, after the creation of the State of Israel, classical terrorism gave way to outwardly more respectable terrorism, designed to cow and subjugate the Palestinians. Palestinian violence, by contrast, is reactive, small scale, but more easily branded as barbaric. We may have misgivings, but we also condemn the terrorism of an Israel which was built on terrorism and continues to glorify its terrorists to this day. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel that is known as the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, or the Yom Kippur War. I call it the 1973 war. Both countries hoped to regain the territories they had lost in 1967. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal and recaptured much of the Sinai Peninsula, and Syria took back some of the Golan Heights. However, Israel successfully counterattacked, and by the time a ceasefire was signed on October 25th, Israeli forces were 30 kilometers from Damascus and 100 kilometers from Cairo. So this map just shows where some of the fighting took place. The Egyptians initially took back a lot of the Sinai Desert, and then the Israelis counterattacked and drove them right back to the Suez Canal. And then up in the north, there was a lot of fighting there back and forth on the Golan Heights. And you can see there was no fighting with Jordan. It was not part of this war. So here are some Egyptian troops crossing the Suez after they'd successfully driven the Israelis back. The war was fought against the backdrop of the Cold War. By this time, the Soviets were backing Egypt and Syria, while Israel remained a stronger than ever American client state. The US warned the Soviets not to intervene while it resupplied Israel. The war boosted Arab morale and banished the demons of the 1967 defeat. For the Israelis, their perception of invincibility was shattered. They'd avoided defeat, but what of the next time? That December, the Americans organized a peace summit in Geneva. There was talk of a Palestinian delegation attending, possibly the PLO. But Israel and the US vetoed the idea, and the conference ended after one session. However, this sparked intense discussions within the PLO. Should they boycott peace negotiations, or should they try to attend as the representative of the Palestinian people? Syria and Egypt hoped that a peace settlement would include the return of the West Bank. But to whom? Jordan? King Hussein still felt it was part of his kingdom. The PLO was divided. One faction rejected compromise, while a second favored a deal that included historic Palestine. A third faction wanted to be part of peace negotiations and govern any territory that Israel might return without forfeiting their right to all of Palestine. One longtime hardliner converted to this, quote, strategy of stages. One longtime hardliner converted to this, quote, strategy of stages. He observed, quote, absolute rejectionism is sometimes a form of escapism. How long can we go on saying no? Is it not a provisional gain to get back part of our land, 23% of Palestine? The PFLP rejected this approach, pointing out that it would require de facto recognition of Israel, the permanent partition of Palestine, and abandoning the armed struggle. In June 1974, the Palestine National Council approved the strategy of stages. The PLO now set its sights on being recognized as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. However, this required Arab support. It wasn't long in coming. In October, the 20 Arab League states met at Rabat in Morocco and proclaimed the PLO as the, quote, sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people in any Palestinian territory that is liberated. This was a huge win. The PLO could now trump Jordan's claim to the West Bank and continue the armed struggle even if Arab states decided on a negotiated peace. As well, any peace negotiations would now have to include the PLO. Then things moved quickly. The UN invited the PLO to its debate on Palestine, and on November 13, Arafat spoke to the General Assembly for nearly 2 hours. He recounted past injustices and talked of his dream of a democratic Palestine where Arabs and Jews could live together in peace and equality. He urged Israelis to join him and turn away from Zionism, which had only offered endless war and bloodshed. His closing words were memorable, quote, today I have come bearing an olive branch and a freedom fighter's gun. Do not let the olive branch fall from my hand. I repeat, do not let the olive branch fall from my hand. So another image of him giving a speech. On November 22nd, the UN General Assembly passed 2 resolutions. 3236 reaffirmed Palestinian rights of self-determination, national independence, and the right of return. It also confirmed that these rights were indispensable for a just peace and that Palestinians should be part of peace negotiations. Resolution 3237 granted the PLO observer status at the UN. Arafat's speech and these resolutions represented the biggest diplomatic victory ever for the Palestinian cause. By the end of 1975, the PLO had opened missions in over 100 countries. The Organization of African Unity declared that Israel was a racist regime, and in mid-November, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 3379 condemning, quote, Zionism as a form of racism and discrimination. However, in spite of the many diplomatic gains, the PLO leadership never grasped the vital importance of winning over American public opinion. The Israelis, of course, had long been masters at the game, and as a result, successfully promoted their narrative equating, quote, Palestinian, 'with terrorist.' American foreign policy remained guided by Cold War priorities. This included massive support of Israel, propping up Jordan with economic and military aid, and more importantly, enticing Egypt away from the Soviets and persuading it to make peace with Israel. This would destroy any remaining pan-Arab unity and weaken the Soviet-sponsored foes of Israel, such as the PLO. The PLO, for their part, wanted to negotiate with the Americans, but they were rebuffed. Reasons included the PLO's apparent terrorist activity, its friendship with the Soviets, its refusal to recognize Israel, and Israel's refusal to take part in any negotiations. And then there was Resolution 242, the linchpin of America's Palestine policy. It excluded the Palestinians as they were only referred to as refugees. Resolution 242 continued to be a dilemma for the PLO as it denied their goal of a state. Historian Rashid Halidi explains, quote, in order to be recognized, the Palestinians were required to accept an international formula that negated their existence. The Palestinians offered to accept the resolution if it was amended to acknowledge Palestinian national rights, but the Americans refused. Amidst all this, a secret influence was at play: American subservience to Israel. In a letter to the Israeli Prime Minister dated September 1st, 1975, President Gerald Ford referred to, quote, the special relationship existing between the United States and Israel, and, quote, the determination of both sides to avoid a situation in which the U.S. and Israel would pursue divergent courses in peace negotiations. He then made a commitment, quote, should the U.S. desire in the future to put forward proposals of its own, it will make every effort to coordinate with Israel its proposals with a view to refraining from putting forth proposals that Israel would consider unsatisfactory. This commitment to subordinate American policy to Israeli priorities remained in place for decades. Halidi observes that from this point on, quote, Israel effectively determined both its own position and that of its sponsor. By 1975, the PLO was a state within a state in Lebanon, controlling the refugee camps, much of South Lebanon, and much of West Beirut. The right-wing Maronite Christians and their Phalangist militias, who were backed by the U.S. and armed and trained by the Israelis, hated the Palestinians. This animosity, combined with other factors, led to Lebanon being engulfed in a civil war. The PLO tried to avoid interfering in the internal affairs of host nations. However, after a Phalangist massacre of Palestinians, it was inextricably drawn into the struggle, partly to protect the refugee camps. The Palestinians were joined by Muslim and leftist militias. After a year of intense fighting, the Arab League sent a Syrian Arab army to restore calm. Curiously, the Syrians sided with the Christians. Sporadic fighting continued for several years, and thousands of Palestinians died. Many historians see the PLO's continued involvement as a costly miscalculation. So a few images from that period. So this is one of the most horrific massacres of the Civil War, the Palestinian camp of Tal el-Zatar. The October 1973 war, Arafat's UN speech, and the UN recognition of the PLO instilled the 48 Palestinians with a sense of pride and strengthened their ties to Palestinians everywhere. They continued to endure systemic discrimination and oppression. One leader commented, quote, "My people is at war with the state that I belong to." The PLO had long neglected the 48 Palestinians, but in December 1975, it endorsed the communist mayoral candidate Tawfiq Zayed in Nazareth. Zayed, a Palestinian, called for an end to land confiscations and discrimination. The Israelis opposed Zayed, but the population were undeterred. Nazareth had no industries, no libraries, and no social services. 48 Palestinians were surrounded by lands that had been in their families for generations, but were now confiscated. They had nothing to lose and were ready to resist, and so they elected Zayed. Here's a small piece of verse that he wrote. So here, I just put this map in because to make it clear where the Galilee is. So it's the area inside the red there to the northern part of the modern state of Israel. And this is where most of the 48 Palestinians lived. And so you could see Nazareth, that was sort of the main city of the region. So that's the Galilee. During the next few months, things came to a head. In spite of massive expropriation of Arab lands, by 1975, there were not many Jewish communities in the Galilee. Israel decided to Judaize the region by expropriating more Arab lands for towns and industries. But Zayed and the 48 Palestinians had had enough, and so they formed the National Committee for the Defense of the Land and announced a nationwide, quote, land day general strike on March 30th. Across the north, tens of thousands of 48 Palestinians took part, throwing stones, barricading roads, burning tires, and chanting Fatah, Fatah, and this village belongs to Palestine, not to Israel. The Israeli police responded with overwhelming force, killing 6 demonstrators and wounding hundreds more. Cries of discrimination were heard. When did the police in Israel ever shoot at Jewish demonstrations? One Palestinian asked. The Land Day demonstrations united the 48 Palestinians with their countrymen in the occupied territories, who had also demonstrated. They resolved to increase their support for the PLO and resist their own slow destruction. Land Day is still commemorated today. By the first Land Day, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza had endured a decade of harsh occupation that had transformed the regions and their lives. In the West Bank, one Palestinian observed that all previous modes of life were shattered. Quote, "The whole social structure was challenged. All previous values and convictions were put to the test." This was largely due to the brutality of the occupation and the accompanying political repression. Then there were the 68,000 West Bankers who worked in Israel as day laborers. They earned much less than Israeli workers, but it was more than they could earn in the West Bank. Every day at work, they saw that the huge disparities between them and the Israelis were solely based on national identity. They were poor because they were Palestinians and an occupied people. Other causes for change include new political leadership, student activism, and economic hardship. A new generation of political leaders who supported the PLO were taking power. West Bank universities were centers of nationalism and producing a new generation of activists. Economic hardship was a constant. Israel exploited cheap labor, imposed heavy taxes, and transformed the population into a huge captive market for Israeli goods. Some positive change took place in late 1972 when West Bank and Gaza nationalists decided to create a united political front and formed the Palestine National Front, or PNF. The mandate was to peacefully confront and resist the Israeli occupation. A founder emphasized, quote, "We wanted to provide a peaceful option based on the right of self-determination." The PNF was an autonomous affiliate of the PLO. It had a collective leadership, and it was represented by all nationalist factions. The PNF focused on building independent, national, representative institutions that did not depend on Israel or Jordan. Everything, day-to-day municipal administration and political, labor, and educational issues, were viewed through a nationalist lens. It also promoted cultural resistance and published Falatin, an underground newspaper, and printed poems supporting resistance. After reading one poem entitled, quote, "Enough for Me," by Palestinian poet Fadwa Tukan, Israeli General Moshe Dayan commented, quote, "This poem is more dangerous than 20 commandos." Clandestine theater groups performed in villages throughout the West Bank, and songs of liberation became popular. So this is the Palestinian poet, Fadwa Tukan. And this is the poem that scared the Israeli general. So I'll give you a moment there to read that. For Israel, the PNF represented one of its biggest fears, an organized link between the PLO and Palestinians in the occupied territories. And so it cracked down on PNF sympathizers. 1974 marked a turning point in the West Bank. The 1973 war, the recognition of the PLO, Arafat's speech, and the many UN resolutions had filled Palestinians with a new sense of hope and determination to resist their occupation. In November, demands for an end to the occupation accompanied strikes, school closures, and protests. Israeli soldiers responded with violence, but this only strengthened the will to resist. Conditions worsened, and in late 1975, mass demonstrations took place. Rocks blocked roads, PLO graffiti covered walls, and forbidden Palestinian flags hung from windows. Resistance intensified in early 1976, especially after the Land Day massacre in Nazareth. Any lingering illusions that the Palestinians had acquiesced to the occupation disappeared. In May, municipal elections were held in the West Bank. During the 1972 elections, the Israelis had backed candidates from the traditional Palestinian elite, as they were less nationalistic and more compliant. But times had changed, and the PLO endorsed candidates for every position and urged people to vote. The Israelis deported 8 candidates, but the results were still a victory for the nationalist cause. Most of the new mayors and councillors were young, confident, well-educated nationalists who demanded Palestinian sovereignty. Their strength was solid as it came from the street and people who had elected them, and they increased their demands to end the occupation. The Israelis realized that they should never have allowed the elections, as, in the words of one official, quote, "They legalized the PLO claim that it represents the Arabs in the West Bank." These were the last elections, and for the next few years, Israel worked hard to weaken the new mayors. However, the Palestinians remained united, demonstrating the samud, or steadfastness, that they were becoming famous for. They would need it. So that's all I have for this week.